Europe of the past saw many wars that determined the fate of wars in the future. Some are well known, while others are forgotten, and a select few of those forgotten were actually really important. One example is that of the Crimean War, which lasted from October of 1853 to February of 1856. It was mainly caused by the issue of influence over the dying Ottoman Empire, where the Russians wanted to expand into the Ottoman Empire, while France and Britain wanted to maintain the balance of power. Soon these tensions boiled over to war, yet through fierce determination and some unique innovations, the British and French eventually came out on top. But what if that isn't what happened, and the Russian horde took control of the Balkans? What if Russia won the Crimean War? First, we need to go through some context. Ever since the 1600s, the Ottoman Empire was in decline, and by the 1800s, European powers became interested in expanding spheres of influence into the Balkans and the Middle East. All of the European powers had their own plans on what to do with the dying Ottoman corpse. Austria wanted to extend their borders into the Balkans. The Russians wanted to establish control over the Orthodox Christians and the Slavs living in the Ottoman Empire. France, under Napoleon III, wanted to extend influence over the Roman Catholics living in the Ottoman Empire, and the British wanted their businesses to prosper with the Ottoman nation. When the Ottomans offered Napoleon III the role of defender of the Christians of the Holy Land, the Russians became furious with the Ottomans. This was because the French were more in favor of Roman Catholics, while the Russians were still not allowed to do the same thing with Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire. Tsar Nicholas I demanded the Ottomans give him the role of defending Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire, but the Turks refused. After all this, the Russians declared war on the Ottoman Empire and occupied Moldova and Wallachia. France and Britain declared war on Russia in reaction and joined the side of the Ottomans. Sardinia also joined this war in order to convince the British and French to support Sardinia in their attempts to unify Italy. So the Crimean War soon began. But now let's ask, how can we get the Russians to win? One of the first ways to help them is Austria, who remained neutral during the war in our timeline. It isn't crazy to imagine Austria considers helping the Russians, as they helped the Austrians put down the Hungarian Revolution of 1848, and they were both members of the Holy Alliance, which was a coalition of monarchies in Europe made up of Prussia, Austria, and Russia. In this alternate timeline, Austria remains an ally of Russia and joins their side in the Crimean War. However, this soon brings up the problem that Prussia might join this war on the side of the Allies, which would upend the whole scenario. So let's say Prussia decides to remain neutral in this war. Secondly, we need the Russians to have a more successful navy. During the war in our timeline, the naval superiority of the British allowed them to land in Crimea and conquer the city of Sevastopol. So let's just say that in this alternate timeline, Russia has a much more powerful navy and gains naval superiority in the Black Sea. They defeat the British in many naval battles and launch landings on the Ottoman coast. For the final cherry on top, we just need to say that Florence Nightingale never exists. Why? Because during the Crimean War, more soldiers died from disease than in combat. For example, cholera was a major problem for the Allies. However, the actions of social reformer Florence Nightingale pioneered modern nursing methods, which saved countless lives. With all that, we can start this scenario. The Crimean War begins in 1853, and the Austrians soon come to Russia's aid. In a bit of irony, since the Austrians joined the war, I doubt any fighting would occur in Crimea itself, so this war would not be called the Crimean War. I don't know what other name to give it, so maybe we can just call it the Great Balkan War. Despite offers made by the Allies, the Prussians don't join the conflict and remain neutral. The military competency of Austria and Russia defeats the Allied armies, while the British Navy suffers defeats at the hands of the Russian Navy. Disease continues to spread through the ranks and causes chaos in the Allied military camps. The war drags out until a stalemate in 1857, when the British facing social unrest due to the unpopularity of the war. Parliament holds a vote, and Great Britain soon exits the war. This gives the Russians and Austrians the chance to destroy any more French and Ottoman opposition. A combined Russo-Austrian force begins to threaten Constantinople. Sardinia at this point would remain neutral and never join the war, as it seems soon to end in a loss. Soon, the Russians capture the city and the Ottoman Empire surrenders in March of 1858, ending the Great Balkan War in Russian victory. The Treaty of St. Petersburg is soon signed in December and lays out the terms of the peace. Austria would annex the Ottoman principalities of Serbia and Bosnia, while Russia annexes Wallachia and Moldova. The Ottomans are forced to demilitarize the Black Sea, securing the region for Russia, and Tsar Nicholas I is declared defender of Orthodox Christians of the Holy Land. Multiple states in the Balkans are created under Austrian and Russian influence. The Ottoman Empire is reduced to just Anatolia, as new states are formed in Mesopotamia and North Africa by native populations, rebelling from the empire. Finally, and most devastatingly of all, the Russians would annex the city of Constantinople, securing their position as the successor of Rome. After all this, what does the aftermath look like? First, the Ottoman Empire was to begin suffering a lot more instability. The victory in the Crimean War in our timeline delayed their collapse, but this loss in the Great Balkan War would be bad, and the Ottoman economy would be hit hard. Secondly, there would be effects on the Italian Wars of Unification. During this time period, Napoleon III's empire was very unstable, so he thought victory in the Crimean War would prove him as the equal of his much more famous uncle. But in this alternate timeline, with the loss of the Great Balkan War, the Second French Empire would never support Sardinia, as they never joined the war, so the Sardinians would lose the Italian Wars of Unification to Austria, who, with Russia's support, would be able to secure influence over all of northern Italy. So it's likely the Austrian Empire remains a great power, and the Ausgleich of 1867 would never happen, so Austria-Hungary never exists. France is also on the breaking point, and the loss of this war may bring a quicker end to Napoleon III's reign, as France would now be in debt. Third, the balance of European power would shift to the Russians immensely. With victory in the Great Balkan War, they would suffer a huge economic struggle, which in our timeline was ended by the Russians selling Alaska to the Americans. In this timeline, Russia never sells Alaska, and Russian America remains a colony. With the Russian Navy not being crushed, they would prove themselves as a naval superpower and a competitor to the British. The Russian victory in the Great Balkan War would rise the tensions of the Great Game in Asia, and the fear of a Russian invasion of British India would still exist. It's possible that the Russians could even support rebellions in India, but it's doubtful that these would succeed. The Russo-Japanese War would still occur, but with the much more powerful Russian Navy, they would win the war, annexing Manchuria and puppeting Korea, and stopping Japan's rise to power. In our timeline, the loss in the Crimean War revealed the corruption and problems in every Russian institution. Tsar Nicholas I was also getting sick and died in 1855, but in this alternate timeline, he may live longer, continue his policies of Russian industrialization and geographical expansion. By the 1860s, the effects of Russian dominance would show themselves in Germany. The Austro-Prussian War would soon break out. The Russians would support the Austrians, putting a lot more pressure on the Prussians. Prussia, facing more attacks by the Russians and Austrians, would spell doom, and Prussia would be forced to make peace. They would be reduced to a smaller kingdom and forced to cede the region of Silesia back to Austria. Russia also takes some parts of East Prussia, stunting the path for German unification. The scramble for Africa would likely still happen and rather be organized by the Austrians instead of the Germans. Colonial claims would probably be the same, except Austria would take a colony in the Horn of Africa, and Russia might even colonize Africa too. In our timeline, there was a Russian plan to colonize Madagascar, but due to distance and problems in the Balkans, it was never done. In this alternate timeline, the Russians don't face these large problems and are able to set up a colony in Madagascar with, relatively, no issues. I also want to briefly bring up the United Kingdom after this war. In our universe, the British public reaction to this war was negative, as it was believed for all the bloodshed they accomplished little directly. The Crimean War was one of the first wars where photography and direct war stories were known to the public, so they could see how bad certain parts of the war were. In this timeline, the unrest is so large that Britain is forced to exit the war. Public opinion would grow distasteful to the royal family, mainly because they were the ones who supported the war in the first place. The public could demand reforms to give more power to the people, just as we saw in Russia in our timeline. If these reforms are refused, could we see a revolution and an end to the monarchy? Unlikely. This war would not have that much of an effect on the British, and a revolution and deposition of the monarchy would not have much backing, so I don't think Britain would be overthrown. By the 20th century, the alliances of our timeline would be unrecognizable, and the next war would likely be between the Russians and the British. Britain would ally with Prussia, France, Japan, and the Ottomans. The Russians would ally with Austria, the smaller Balkan states, and the South German states. With tensions rising across the world, the war to end all wars is coming soon, but how it will start is beyond me. Until then, this has been the Cooper Chronicles, and next time we will be discovering what would have happened if the United States became a monarchy. Bye!